Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to our live conversation. I'm Bob Lavinia. This is my colleague, Janelle Callahan. We are live from CPS HR headquarters in Sacramento, California. Thanks very much for being with us today. We're excited to be with you to launch our Institute for Public Sector Employee Engagement. Today, we'll introduce you to the Institute, including our plans for the future.
We are also going to preview results from our new national study on employee engagement.
And then after that, and maybe most important, we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions about the Institute, about our research, or even about employee engagement in general. But let me start with a little background about the two of us. I've worked in or around government for more than 40 years, and I hope some of you are thinking that I don't look that old, but nevertheless, it includes 30 years in public sector HR. I've served in federal, state, and local government, and in public higher education. Last July, I joined CPS to become director of our new institute. I've also written a book that really reflects much of what I've learned during my career. It's called Engaging Government Employees. Here it is. It was published by the American Management Association, and I'm pleased to say is now in its second printing. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I really believe in the power of employee engagement to improve government performance. But also, I wanted to focus on the unique challenges of improving engagement in government. And I think these challenges, things like the public visibility of everything that we do, political leaders who can change literally overnight, and with them their policies, multiple stakeholders who sometimes have different and often conflicting demands, difficult to measure results, limited ability to reward performance financially, and so on. I think these things can make it harder in some respects to manage in government. In the book, among other topics, I explore how these differences affect our efforts in the public sector to measure and improve engagement.
And I'm a professional researcher and data analyst, and Bob and I began working together back in 2008 at the nonprofit Partnership for Public Service in Washington, D.C., when we produced the best places to work in the federal government rankings. And we love how rankings and comparative data can be illuminating and really drive change. And we got to know some amazing people in the federal government who are doing great things, and in particular the people at the Office of Personnel Management who have really been leading the charge on employee engagement for over a decade.
And we really think federal agencies have some good resources and opportunities to share learning about engagement, but we think state and local governments can really use more support, and that's why we created the Institute, to serve as a resource. Part of this commitment is our Institute website, which already has resources to help public sector organizations, and we'll continue to build these resources. And you know, this support is important because I think that the biggest challenge facing government, and really at all levels, federal, state, and local, and CPS is a public agency, is attracting, developing, engaging, and retaining talent. Because, you know, after all, we really can't get anything done in government unless we have talented and engaged people. We can have the best ideas and policies, but unless we have people who can get things done, we can't implement these ideas and policies. And that's why we're so excited about the potential of employee engagement to improve the ability of government to deliver consistently high quality services. It's all about performance, and that's why we have created the Institute.
So Bob, what do you say to people who might question why we should care about employee engagement in government at all?
Yeah, you know, this often comes up when I speak to organizations and groups about employee engagement. And the answer is really simple. Public sector organizations that improve engagement improve their performance, period. For example, I recently gave a talk to a group of county administrators, and afterwards, one of the administrators came up to me and said he'd heard a lot about employee engagement, but didn't realize there is a science, and that's the word he used, around engagement. Well, you know, maybe it's not a science like nuclear physics, but there is a strong research-based business case for why we should care about engagement, why it matters, especially in government. As I said earlier, it's about performance and service delivery. That is, public sector organizations that have improved engagement have also improved performance. The research shows that engagement is linked to important results in government, things like achieving strategic goals, providing responsive customer service, improving productivity, retaining talented employees, and even better employee attendance. And I like to talk about the city of Minneapolis, which has been conducting employee surveys for at least a decade. and more important, acting on the results. Last year, Atlantic Monthly Magazine ran a story entitled "The Miracle of Minneapolis." Here's what it looks like. The subheading was, "No other place mixes affordability, opportunity, and wealth so well. What's its secret?" And I think part of the secret is the city's unwavering focus on the quality and well-being of its workforce.
So Bob, let's talk about what we hope to come about with our efforts.
Sure. The goal of our institute is to help public and nonprofit sector organizations across the country measure and improve engagement, again, as a key way to improve performance. And we're doing this in several ways. By administering our engagement survey for government organizations, a survey we developed specifically for the public sector, and then helping these organizations and jurisdictions analyze the results and decide what actions to take. Our commitment is to help these organizations through implementation and even after. We also provide engagement information and resources on our new website, which you can access through cpshr.us. And we also hope to develop a best places in state and local government rankings. We think this will be a great tool, not just for the rankings, but also to help states and local governments learn from each other about how to build engagement. And of course, along these lines, one of the most helpful things we think we have in the Institute is our original research. So let's talk a little bit now about the results of our national study on employee engagement.
Sure. So in June of 2016, we commissioned a national poll, and our goal was to study levels of engagement in the public and private sectors. And today we're here to share some of the high-level findings, and in February, we'll be releasing a report that details all of the findings, including engagement results by federal, state, and local government levels. So we measured engagement using 6 questions focused on emotional attachment and commitment to the organization. And we used an average of the questions and then classified employees as either disengaged, somewhat engaged, or engaged. And what we found was interesting. The private sector worker engagement was higher than the public sector engagement. And we found that 44% of private sector employees were engaged, while only 38% of public sector employees were engaged.
Now, these results are not only interesting, but they make sense to us. Going back to what I said earlier about the unique characteristics of managing in government, we think these differences also create challenges to building engagement in the public sector.
But there is a real change for opportunity for change in government, isn't there? As new leaders take over, we have not only new leaders in Washington, but also in states and local governments, and more to come over the next 2 years. Bob, you've written about changes in political leadership and how they relate to engagement. Could you say a little more?
Sure. I've argued that newly elected and appointed leaders, including in states and governments, really have a unique opportunity to focus on their workforces and on employee engagement. These new leaders need to understand that public servants will make or break their policy agendas, and this workforce focus should include measuring and improving employee engagement. Last year, I was real fortunate to participate in a briefing on public sector workforce issues for 2 mayoral candidates in a large U.S. city. When it was my turn to speak, I emphasized that this new mayor would have a unique opportunity to take the temperature of the city workforce through a comprehensive employee engagement survey. And then I suggested that the newly elected mayor wouldn't have to own the workforce problems or issues, but could earn the solutions by taking action on the survey results. This opportunity, with a minimum of political risk, would only occur once in the new administration. And I was pleased to learn recently that the mayor has decided to survey city employees, and just as important, is committed to acting on the results. Now, another important aspect of our new research was to identify the drivers of employee engagement. So, Janelle, what do we mean by a driver, and what did we find?
Sure. So this is part of what we are doing that I think is really important. We're not just looking at what the scores are. We're also doing analysis to understand what factors have the biggest impact on the engagement score. So you may hear people talk about drivers of engagement, and sometimes the term is used very loosely to describe things we know are associated with engagement. But what we have done is statistical analysis to arrive at that conclusion of what is a driver. We're talking about a key driver. We did regression analysis to determine which of the factors have the biggest impact on engagement. And this tells us the factors, if improved, are also most likely to improve engagement. So our framework also looks at 2 different types of drivers. First, we have the workplace factors. drivers, things like leadership, supervision, training, directly related to the roles and systems within the organization. And second, we have culture drivers of engagement, so the things that theoretically everyone has a chance to influence. Things like promoting a culture of innovation, appreciation, or inclusion, for example. So what did we find? Interestingly, we found no differences in the top drivers between the private and public sector employees. So leadership and managing change, the work itself, and training and development were the top drivers. In other words, we found that when these scores are high, engagement scores also tend to be high. So we know that these things are really important to engagement, but unfortunately, the results for the public sector are significantly lower for the top driver. We found that employees in the private sector were far more likely to be positive about leadership and managing change, and say that change is managed well in their organizations.
You know, this is an important finding for government, especially since the number of retirements is on the upswing across the entire public sector. So what that means is we're going to need to replace the leaders who are departing. And while this is a challenge for sure, it's also an opportunity to develop a new generation of leaders who can manage change and build high engagement organizations. I want to mention an example of what I mean, and it's from the private sector. And even though I'm always reluctant to suggest that just because they do something in business, we should do the same thing in government. But I think this anecdote really makes sense for us too. I travel a lot, including coming to Sacramento this week, and I usually fly on Delta. And every time I walk onto a Delta plane, it's been named a great place to work on several lists, including Fortune's best companies to work for. And last month, I was listening to the NPR radio show Marketplace. I'm sure many of you know this program. The host, a guy by the name of Kai Risdale, often ends the show by interviewing a CEO. On this show, he interviewed the Delta CEO, and he always asks the CEOs to describe in 5 words or less what their jobs are. And he said most CEOs just can't do it. Well, when he asked the Delta CEO, he immediately said, my job is to take care of our people, all 85,000 of them. And I think this philosophy really explains why Delta is at the top of these lists, and I think leaders in government ought to adopt that philosophy as well.
This also really started discussion on drivers. As I mentioned, we also looked at cultural drivers of engagement, and we found that the top culture driver engagement for public and private sector was, I feel valued for the work I do. The government score, however, was significantly lower than the private sector. Only 67% of government respondents agreed with the statement, compared with 72% of private sector respondents. And the second most important cultural driver of engagement in both sectors was, I feel encouraged to come up with new and better ways of doing things. Again, despite the relative importance of these factors in both sectors, we found significant differences in the scores. Only 64% of government respondents agreed with the statement, compared with 70% in the private sector. So this leads to a question: if there's someone out there who's thinking, all of this sounds great, but I have limited time and resources, sure. Bob, what is the most important thing I can do?
Well, I get asked this question a lot, and part of my answer is that we don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all solution to improving engagement, especially since there are more than 90,000 government jurisdictions across the nation. That's why we suggest that each organization needs to survey its employees to identify key areas of improvement. However, as you suggest, from our research, particularly on the cultural drivers, we do have a few ideas to offer. First of all, it's about appreciation and recognition, as you suggested. More than 60% of employees who leave their jobs say that lack of appreciation was a key factor in their decision. So we need to show that we appreciate great performance, but the appreciation doesn't have to be financial. We know that can be tough in government. Showing appreciation can mean simply thanking our people for doing a good job, but our thanks need to be genuine and specific. And in a larger scale, there's also the annual national celebration of public service called Public Service Recognition Week, which is the first week in May of each year. This is an opportunity for us to celebrate the work and accomplishments of public servants in a broader and much more public way. We also need to promote innovation, to listen, to ask for ideas, to take our employees seriously, and give our folks a safe space to try new approaches without the fear of failure. That can be tough in government, I know that, given the visibility of everything we do, but it's important. And then take personal responsibility for our own engagement. It's important for all of us to understand our personal motivations and how we can best contribute to feel good about what we do. Improving engagement isn't just management's job, it's everyone's job. So this is just a few suggestions from our research. We have much more on our website, which you can access through cpshr.us, and in the report that we'll issue next month. So having said all of this, what's our bottom line today? Well, we've created the Institute to help focus attention and action on engagement in government, especially at the state and local government levels. As our new research shows, engagement in the public sector is low, Janelle, as you described. But this is kind of a bad news, good news story. Of course, we want engagement to be higher as a key way to improve the ability of government to deliver consistently high quality service. But low engagement also means there is tremendous potential to improve government performance by improving engagement. That's what the Institute is about, and we are committed to be a resource and do everything we can to help public sector organizations measure and improve engagement. So we want to now answer some of your questions, but I want to end by saying we really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you, pun intended, in this way today. We are just getting started with the Institute. We have a lot more that will be coming up. We encourage you to go to our website and find out what we have in store as we launch our blog and we produce our research report next month. So we have some questions? Okay, so I'm going to read the questions. Why the differences in leaders between the public and private sectors? What do you think about that, the findings that you shared about leadership?
You mean the qualities of the leaders? Or?
Well, the difference in the responses between the public and private sector on the question about leadership and managing change.
Right, right. So the questions with the lowest scores were about managing change in the organization, and so this was something that we suspected might be the case, but we know that government has some challenges in how organizations are managed, and we found that our survey results really supported that fact that we know that change is hard in government. Yeah, and hard and sometimes a little slower than it might be in the private sector. Another question is, how often should we conduct engagement surveys? This is an important question because there's sort of an ongoing conversation in both the academic and practitioner literature about how often to survey. In the federal government, previously the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, which is a federal government-wide survey, was conducted every 2 years, but now it's conducted annually. And I think the trend is towards more frequent surveying. But the other side of that coin is you have to provide enough time between surveys for organizations to actually do something with the results. So that means results have to be shared and analyzed quickly. One solution to this question is to conduct annual surveys, but then in between conduct pulse surveys. So we have some real-time data on how people feel in addition to the more comprehensive surveys. So here's another question. Let's see. If you want to perform a study, which I believe means a survey, do you have recommended questions that we should include? And once it's completed, how do we go about acting on the results? Can you talk a little bit about the survey questions? Right. So we developed a survey specifically for the public sector, which we will share with anyone who's interested. And really, what we wanted to do was create a survey that is really relevant to the public sector and relevant to different types of employees across the public sector. And so it's a very comprehensive survey. It has a measure of engagement. It has measures for different workplace factors, like we mentioned, and also the organizational culture questions, which we think are really important too. And then the taking action part of it, it's really understanding the results and the different possibilities. Do you want to say more about taking action? Sure. One of the things that we think is critically important is the commitment to take action on survey results. If an organization surveys its employees and asks its employees to tell them how they feel, and then doesn't do anything with the results, that organization is going to be worse off. So we really like to see organizations make an upfront commitment, including from the senior leader, that they're going to share the results and then act on the results, and think
early on in the process about how they're going to take action. It's one thing to get a set of data and then decide and then try to figure out how you're going to take action. It's another thing to really think that through up front so that you know how you're going to proceed after you get the survey results. Okay, how do you suggest, another question, how do you suggest we handle the challenge of selling management on the importance of engagement improvement initiatives? I want to answer that one because that comes up often, particularly when new administrations take over. I was speaking at an event a couple of years ago, and one of the other folks on the panel was in charge of employee engagement initiatives for a state. And I remember her saying that how excited she was about what they were doing and how much she hoped if a new governor came in that they would continue the initiative. And I remember turning to her and saying, I hope you do it regardless of who the governor is. So I really think it's about making the business case. As we emphasized earlier, it's about performance. If engagement is perceived as, or actually is, just another HR initiative or seen as, let's make our employees happy or it's a touchy-feely thing, it's going to be very difficult to sustain. We have to make the business case to new leaders, and to use the word in the question, to sell them on it, to convince them that this is important for organizational performance, that if we focus on the workforce, if we improve engagement, we will achieve better organizational outcomes, and they ought to be interested in that.
Right, and if I could just add, I think there's a lot of good research out there connecting employee engagement with results, but that's something that we hope to do as well. We hope to work with more public sector organizations to get research connecting engagement and performance outcomes.
Here's an interesting question. I noticed that you have a question on in your engagement index in the survey that says, I feel comfortable being myself at work. Can you explain how that links to engagement? And what if we don't want our employees to be too comfortable or overly relaxed at work? We'd still like high productivity from employees. So I think the answer to this in part goes to how we define comfortable.
Right, and we want people to feel like they can be themselves at work, and this is a question actually from the Merit Systems Protection Board. This is a U.S. federal agency that's done a lot of great work on employee engagement, and they included it in their most recent survey, and we think this is an important concept. It's also been around in the private sector as something seen as important, and it's about people feeling comfortable, but also promoting excellence. Make no doubt about it. It's you need both of those things, to have it work.
And we don't equate being comfortable with being sort of physically relaxed. When I was at the University of Wisconsin, where I was assistant vice chancellor for HR, we used to say, we don't want our folks to have to check their personalities at the door. We want them to be able to be their real selves and be comfortable in their personalities, as long as that was consistent with appropriate workforce behavior. So we want people to be able to feel that they can really behave at work with their true personalities and true selves. So I think that's what we mean. That is what we mean by comfortable. Another question, do you have recommendations on the best way to form a diverse and productive employee engagement committee? Do you recommend a committee? And when I was at the university, we did a campus-wide engagement survey that covered 13 separate divisions. And in each of the divisions, we encouraged them to form committees of employees, cross-section of employees, to help them take a look at and analyze the results and make recommendations to improve engagement and improve performance. And I remember one of the divisions wanted to put together a committee consisting solely of managers, and we said we didn't think that was a very good idea. So yes, I think it's important to put together a committee and really empower the committee to help analyze the data and make suggestions. I think the committee has to be representative of the organization horizontally in terms of different occupations, as well as vertically in terms of different levels within the organization.
Right, and I think with the committees too, it's another chance, yet another chance to engage employees. A good survey will give you some findings and questions to explore, but it's really the employees and figuring out what really makes sense, what to do, and we think it's a good strategy to create employee groups to take action.
So Brett asks the question, who has the greater impact on the engagement of employees, senior management or direct supervisors? And this is interesting. Is the size of the organization a factor? What do you think?
Well, we know that senior leaders do have a big impact on our engagement score. It's the top driver. And, as far as size of the organization, that's a really interesting question. And that's something that I hope we, can explore in our research because we do know that, smaller organizations, tend to have some advantages because they can have all of their employees in a room for an all-employee meeting or things
Sure.
like that. So it's a very interesting question, and we'll definitely look into it more.
And I also want to reiterate something that we talked a little bit about earlier, and that is engagement is sometimes seen as something that management should do to the rest of the organization, but really it's got to be, it takes a village, and individual employees also have to be involved in the conversation. This is not something that management does to the organization. This is something that everyone in the organization has to make a commitment to, and that's really the way to create a culture of engagement and sustain it over time. Another question, going again to leadership. What's more important for a leader, technical knowledge or good managerial skills? Seems like having good interpersonal skills is overlooked for technical knowledge in government. I'm going to take a crack in that. One of the things that I like to point out when I talk about this is that it's important to create a culture of engagement, and part of that means putting people into leadership positions who can be good leaders, not just because they have good technical skills or because they've been around for a long time, and try to identify those people who have the potential to create high engagement organizations, and there are various ways to do that. So while I think there's a place for technical skills, we really want our leaders to be leaders. We want them to understand the technical components of the work, but we also want them to understand that their job is to manage and lead, not necessarily do the hands-on work. Let's see. Okay, we got a couple of more questions coming in. So here's actually more of a comment than a question. It says, I think people being totally themselves at work is the only way to get the most from them. Engagement must come from within based on encouragement from above, right? So I guess that is kind of a question. So engagement must come from within based on encouragement from above. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we hope that employees can be aware enough of their own feelings that they can really tap into that as well, and the organization should support that.
Yeah, I like to think of it as the organization creating opportunities for people to be their best selves at work. We want to create workplaces that allow people to become engaged, that enable them to have that personal connection between the work that they do and the mission of the organization. We want to make sure that the organization values its employees so employees can feel proud of where they work. So it really is a two-way street, and I think as I mentioned earlier, the momentum around employee engagement is moving away from it's just management responsibility to it's a shared responsibility. Let's see, anything else? Oh, yeah, there's a question. What are examples of how we can recognize employee performance and achievement? We talked about it, but we provided a couple of examples. What do you think about that?
Well, so one of the things Bob mentioned was Public Service Recognition Week, and that's a great opportunity to honor your workers. This is a chance to be part of something that is a national effort, and again, that's the first week of May. And what Bob said also was with appreciation. We know that it's also important to have more personal recognition, and so. When employees really do go above and beyond to contribute to the mission, having some sort of recognition, but then also making sure it's the right type of recognition for the person. So knowing if it's the type of person who would appreciate being acknowledged in an all-staff meeting, or if it's the type of person who would like, a handwritten note from the leader. But there are lots of ways to recognize employees, but it's most important to really find those specific examples and honor that.
Yeah, I was speaking to an HR director in a state agency a couple of weeks ago, and she said her employees in her agency, are tired of these sort of generic thank yous from senior leaders without any specificity or without really thanking them for specific work that they did and specific outcomes that they achieved. So to reiterate what Janelle said, recognition needs to be authentic and it needs to be specific, not just thanks, but thanks for what you did and how you enabled us to succeed. And there's also, University of Wisconsin Hospital and Clinics has put together a toolkit for supervisors in which it includes a list of ways you can recognize performance without spending a dime, because as we mentioned earlier, we know that it is difficult in the public sector to substantially and significantly acknowledge performance with money, but it doesn't always have to take money. It really is about genuine and specific ways to acknowledge people's contributions. There's another question from Evelyn, why do you think there is such a difference between engagement in the public versus private sectors? And you talked a little bit about that.
Right. So we know that there are just some unique challenges with government. So we weren't too surprised to see that there was a difference. We'll be sharing the results of our research later this month, and there are some differences between the levels of government. But we think there are just some more challenges that make it difficult for public sector employees.
I also want to mention that the last several years have been tough for the public sector and public sector employees. Lots of criticism about government, the size of government, the effectiveness of government, the scope of government, budget cuts, and these things can't help but have an impact on individual public servants. So, within that environment and that context, that kind of constant drumbeat of criticism, it has to have an impact. And that's why I think it's important for us throughout government at all levels to try to really emphasize all of the very important and positive things that government does for the people that we serve day in and day out. Let's see, anything else? Here's one. Could you give a bit more detail on the drivers of engagement, specific behaviors and practices that correlate to engagement? Here's somebody who wants us to give them the whole report today, which we're not going to do, but
I can say a little bit more.
A little more.
Happy to say a little bit more. So the number one driver was leadership and managing change, and for leadership, we know that visibility can be very important. So we have a question in that category on how visible the senior leaders are. And so, in public sector organizations, they can be quite large, but still we do feel like leaders having connections with employees, even if it's, they have to have a town hall online with 5,000 of their employees,
right.
But to have that, for leaders to have some visibility, to be seen as the one who's really leading the organization and really inspiring and motivating their employees.
And Janelle gave you a pretty high level description of the drivers. We also have identified drivers for different levels of government, and there are some differences between federal, state, and local. But you're going to have to wait for the report for that kind of detail. Okay, another one. Okay, someone wants me to repeat the University of Wisconsin recognition information, missed the title and would like to research it. It's actually from the University of Wisconsin Hospital and Clinics, which is I'm not affiliated anymore with the University of Wisconsin, but the hospital and clinics has been conducting employee engagement surveys for 10 or 15 years and has a very rigorous process to act on the data. And one of the issues that came up there, in addition to the quality of supervision, was employee recognition. So as part of a toolkit that the hospital created for its supervisors, it included a list of ways to recognize employees without spending a dime. And if you contact me, and we'll provide contact information, I'll be happy to send you that list. Let's see. Anything else? I'm looking. Yeah, here is another question about leadership, and actually about direct supervision. And I'll paraphrase it. We talked about the difference between managers and supervisors, but what are some of the specific things that supervisors can do to improve the engagement levels of the people who report to them?
Right. So with the supervisors, there's a lot, and I think one of the biggest things is having really helpful performance conversations, getting really helpful feedback on how you're doing, and really just having the supervisor be available to the person as well for those types of conversations, and to feel supported by their supervisor.
Yeah, interestingly, a very nice piece of research done in the federal government trying to figure out what the differentiators were between the high engagement federal agencies and the low engagement federal agencies. And Janelle, as you suggested, what they found was the single biggest differentiator was performance management. That is, supervisors in the high engagement agencies did the things you just described better than supervisors in the low engagement agencies. And I think it's significant because it's really not HR stuff. It's supervisors engaging, pun intended, with their employees around expectations, around development, around performance reviews, and doing that in a positive and constructive way. We're going to wrap up the questions in a couple of minutes, so if you have any last questions, please submit them. But here's one, and this has actually come up a couple of times, particularly when I've talked to folks in labor unions. And the question is, it's a bit cynical, but isn't employee engagement just about getting more productivity out of our employees? And my answer to that, and as I said, this is not the first time I've been asked that question, is no, it's not. Because high engagement organizations are organizations that value their employees, that have supervisors who care about their employees, who give their employees voice and listen to their opinions, who understand the need for work-life balance. So I really look at it as a win-win type of situation. Yes, high engagement improves organizational performance, but it improves organizational performance because high engagement organizations care about the well-being of their employees. So it is not a cynical attempt to just squeeze more work out of people. It's really about caring for the people we work with and caring about their well-being. So do we have any, let's see, go down to the bottom here. Any last minute questions? If not, we're gonna wrap up. We appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. This is a new medium for us, so we're excited about it, and we hope to continue to have these kinds of conversations. There's a lot more coming from the Institute, including a blog, website resources. You can go to cpshr.us to access the Institute for Public Sector Employee Engagement website. Our report will issue in February, which will have much more detailed data on our national survey of employee engagement. And we'd be happy to talk to any of you. I think we're sharing our contact information. Anything we can do to help you, even if it's just to talk on the telephone about how you can measure and improve employee engagement. So,
Yes, thank you again for joining us on Facebook Live today, and we look forward to hearing from you and sharing our research and really helping. So thank you.